It was 1954, and I was 6 years old and in the first grade at Sugarloaf School, which was 6 miles west of Antlers, Oklahoma, on the Miller Jumbo Road. Literally on the line on the map between the colors that indicate the Ozarks to the east and the Great Plains to the west. We were living out in the country and sharecropping peanuts on Miss Melton's place. It was in the fall and everyone was starting to thrash their peanuts. It took a pretty good crew of people to run a stationary thrasher, and my dad and mom were working on Terry Don Paul's thrashing crew, helping thrash other farmers' peanuts and trading out their labor so Terry Don could come thrash our peanut crop. This barter system was a pretty common practice in southeast Oklahoma, where no one had any money. My mom had told me that day when I come home from school they would probably still be in the peanut fields, but not to worry, because they would be home soon and she would leave me some cookies there on the table. That all sounded fine to me at the time, so I didn't have a worry to my soul that day when I headed off to school. Sure enough, when I got home from school there was no one there, but the cookies were right there on the table like my mom had promised. So all was well in my 6-year-old world. I remember that after I ate a couple of the cookies, saving some for later, I made a point of changing out of my school clothes into my play clothes. At this time I was feeling pretty grown up, being all alone at the house, so I found some old leftover cornbread in the kitchen and took it outside, called the chickens and crumbled it up and spread it on the ground for them to eat. We didn't have a pen for a chicken, so they just ran around the place, always looking for food, and we in turn were always running around the place looking for where the chickens hid their nests if we wanted to have any eggs. I was pretty much enjoying my situation of being all alone at the house and feeling much more mature than my 6 years due to all the responsibility that had been laid upon my little shoulders. If my mom and dad had shown up during this well-lit envelope of time, everything would have been just fine. But sometimes fate can rock the boat, and fate was arriving quickly with the setting of that Oklahoma sun, and my little boat was heading directly into the dark storm. I remember Mama saying they would be home before dark, and since it was not really dark yet, I kept telling myself not to worry. They'd be home any minute. It was right about this time I started telling myself I wasn't scared and that I had nothing to worry about, and trying my best to convince myself that it was true. As the sun dropped lower and it grew darker, this would become a pretty hard sell for my runaway imagination. I remember that I was as worried about my parents and thinking that one of them may have gotten hurt. Working around a peanut thrasher was pretty dangerous work, and I was able to create some pretty gruesome scenarios that would have done the future novels of Stephen King proud. Like I said, my first thoughts were for my parents' safety, but I didn't have to dwell on them very long before I started to think about myself, and the darker it got, the more scared I became. I knew my parents would be coming home, that is, if they were ever coming home again, from the west up the dirt road that ran by our house. They had taken our wagon and team to Terry Don's to be used to haul the peanuts from the fields to the thrashing machine, and since we did not have a car, that would be how they got home. I decided I would walk down the road to the top of the hill in the direction they would be arriving, and I could see way down that road as soon as I got to the top of the hill, which was about 100 yards west of our house. I called my dog as I set up toward the top of the hill where I could get a good view down the road, and figured I would see our wagon when I got there. It was a pretty big disappointment as I topped the hill with no wagon in sight, and there was no doubt now that it was definitely getting darker by the minute. I stood there at the top of the hill for as long as I could see anything down the road. Then I called my dog, and one dejected, scared little boy turned for home. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I heard something rustle in the woods off to the side of the road, and away ran my dog to chase whatever demon it was out there lurking in the dark. That was the last I would see of my dog for the night, and it was one sad, lonesome little boy that walked the last few steps back to the most scary house in Poteau County. When I walked in the door, I realized I was no better in the house than I was outside, because it was darker in here than it was outside. We did not have electricity, and I had been warned more than once not to ever touch the kerosene lamps we used for light. I had enough sense, even at 6 years old, to know that trying to light the kerosene lamp was way too dangerous, and I could end up burning the house down or breaking the thin glass lamp globes and cutting myself. Thus, I was not even sure I knew how to light one anyway. Instead of just sitting there in the dark, I crawled up on my mom and dad's bed and buried my face in my mom's pillow and just started crying and hoping I could go to sleep and wake up and mom and dad would be there and my world would be right again. Unfortunately, my story was to get a lot worse before it got better. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard something underneath the bed, and by this time I was so scared I was way beyond reason, and I knew it was bound to be a rattlesnake. I lay there with my head buried in my mom's pillow, too scared to move, but knowing somehow I had to get off the bed and out of the house before this imagined rattlesnake bit me. It got quiet underneath the bed, and I decided to make my move. I eased to the foot of the bed and jumped out to the middle of the floor and headed for the front door. When I got to the front door, I opened it, then looked back to see my little kitten coming out from under the bed where the rattlesnake was. I scooped him up and headed outside. It would be a couple more days before I even thought of the possibility that Kitty was probably the rattlesnake under Mom's bed. It didn't seem quite as dark now after my ordeal inside the house, so I hung on tightly to my kitten and heard my dog barking out in the woods. I was pretty disappointed with the dog's loyalty, but I sure was wishing I had just a little bit of his courage right now. I headed down toward the barn and crawled up on the pole fence, making sure I didn't let Kitty get away. Our old milk cow, Roz, lifted up her head from the empty feed trough like she thought I would have the answers as to who was going to feed and milk her. I felt a little better now, sitting there on the fence surrounded by Roz and Kitty, and for a while I just sat there quietly. But that feeling did not last long. I got to thinking about how hopeless everything was for me, and missing my parents so bad I just couldn't hold back the tears, and I just kept petting the little kitty and wondering what was going to happen to me. I finally stopped crying and just sat there quietly watching the world turn black. I'm not sure how long I sat on the corral, probably closer to 15 minutes than the lifetime it seemed at the time. But then the silence and the darkness was broken by a car headed up our house from the east. I remember the last awful thought I would have that night was that someone was coming to tell me something bad had happened to my parents. As the car drew closer, I saw that it was Terry Don's old Chevrolet, and when they stopped and opened the door, the car's interior light lit up the most beautiful sight I had ever seen in my life. There was my mom getting out of the car, and right behind her was my dad. I was so relieved I almost started to cry again. When my mom called out, "Lonnie," my voice broke when I hollered back, "I'm down at the corral." I started to put the kitten down because I knew they would know I had been scared if they saw me hanging onto it. But then I remembered how I felt when my dog had deserted me earlier tonight, so I just held on to the cat and petted it so he would know how much I appreciated his loyalty. And I was not about to cast him away now that everything was okay. Mom came down to the corral and climbed up on the fence and sat real close to me and started to explain how they had had to work much later than they ever expected, and they had left the team at Terry Don's and he had drove them home so they could get back to me as soon as possible. I told her it's okay. She took out her handkerchief and wiped my face. She asked me if I'd been crying. I said, "A little bit." She hugged me a little tighter and said, "Me too." And we both sat there on the corral and petted the cat together.